coronavirus numbers have spiked sharply in the U.S. The country has recorded its worst single daily death toll since the pandemic began and a record high number of hospitalizations. On Wednesday, at least 2,760 people died, while hospitalizations topped 100,000. Let's get the latest from our Washington correspondent, Simon Mark. Simon, you know, we're talking about how our numbers are spiraling out of control here in South Africa and what measures are not being adhered to. What's happening in the U.S.? Your numbers keep climbing.
Well, it's an absolute catastrophe here, Shahan. I mean, this is the country that simply cannot help itself. Americans are waking up to the news this morning that yesterday as many people died from COVID-19 as perished in the Al-Qaeda attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. on September the 11th, 2001. And that pattern looks set to continue for many days to come. More than 2,760 deaths yesterday alone. Nearly 205,000 cases of new infections reported yesterday, and for the first time yesterday in the United States, more than 100,000 people were in hospitals all over the country being treated for COVID-19. And the tragedy here is that we all could see this was coming. Last week, the Thanksgiving holiday, millions of Americans ignoring public health advice here, more than 9 million Americans passing through the country's airports, disregarding pleas from the Centers of Disease Control not to travel over the Thanksgiving holiday, 40 million Americans taking to the roads. Now the country is beginning to pay the price for that kind of disregard of the advice that's coming from the government's public health advisors. And tellingly, Shahan, the advice is not coming from President Trump himself. From the White House, we have heard absolute silence on the issue of these rising numbers of COVID-19 infections, hospitalizations and deaths, with some public health officials fearing that by the time the winter really gets underway here and Joe Biden becomes President of the United States next January, the death toll here could have reached as many as 450,000 people. It currently stands at around 270,000. So the situation here absolutely dire now.
Yeah, definitely. It's something to be worried about. But clearly, as you say, Donald Trump not really saying much. So, Simon, let's talk about the responsibility of citizens then, because you have a president who many would argue has been misleading the nation about the consequences of COVID-19. Why are people so lax when it comes to keeping themselves safe?
Shahan, at the end of the day, leadership on this pandemic anywhere in the world comes from the top. This White House is hosting Christmas parties every day, mask-free. 900 people have been invited to Mike Pompeo's various Christmas parties that he's holding on the upper floor of the State Department building here in Washington. Again, no indication that masks are required by people who attend it. So the government itself is misleading the country here by example, and millions of Americans are taking their cues from a president who is now voicing relentlessly conspiracy theories about the election, continuing to claim that it was rigged when it wasn't. And he's also voiced conspiracy theories about COVID-19 many months ago, of course, describing it as a hoax, not an issue that Americans particularly needed to worry about because his government, he claimed at the time, had the situation under control. This is a country where many Americans jealously guard their freedoms to reject government advice, and it is only advice, it's recommendations. There's nothing mandatory about the measures that organizations like the Centers for Disease Control are recommending to members of the American public.
That's the difference. We have regulations here where you can be prosecuted, but we're not really seeing that there. The hope of a vaccine, we know that in the UK it could be rolled out next week. What's it looking like in the US?
Yeah, well, the Trump administration thinks that it may have successfully vaccinated as many as 10 million Americans by the end of the year. I mean, that might be a bit of a steep target to attain, given that one of the vaccines, the Moderna vaccine, we don't think is likely to receive approval until a few days before Christmas. The head of the Food and Drug Administration was hauled into the White House yesterday. It seems that President Trump was displeased that the United Kingdom approved the use of the Pfizer vaccine before the US authorities have approved its use. So certainly a fire is being lit under the FDA to get the vaccines approved and out there. But that's not going to do anything over the short term to mitigate this rising death toll and the rising caseload and the pressure that is being put on hospitals across the country. Governor Gavin Newsom in California says that every single intensive care bed in the entire state will be occupied on the current trajectory by Christmas Eve. So even with the vaccine rollout, we're looking at a very grim Christmas and New Year period here.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Our correspondent in Washington, D.C., Simon Marks.